A couple weeks ago, we showed you, I interviewed this man right here, Mr. Number One, George South. George South had some very strong words for his once student, Charlie Dreamer. Tonight, the consequences of this matchup, either way, could be monumental to professional wrestling. George, you're taking on Charlie Dreamer, your student.
You know, my head is not in this tonight. You know, the one thing I don't understand is what Charlie Dreamer's got up his sleeve. You know, I actually thought after my interview a few days ago that Charlie Dreamer would call this whole thing off. And I don't know who he's listening to. He's still a good friend. I love you, Charlie Dreamer. I love you just like you're one of my sons. But I guess it's going to come down to this. Now, you've known me for a long time, and a lot of those wrestling fans have known me 40 years in this professional wrestling business. I hate this tonight more than I've ever hated anything in my life. Now, Charlie Dreamer, I hope that when the smoke clears and this thing's over, it doesn't matter whose career's over. You see, we both lose, Charlie Dreamer. We both lose tonight because two best friends are going to fight tonight.
Oh, my, broke the table in half. Time will tell. My God! Look at that, you always get that in alive a minute. Oh, devastating suplex. Folks, this could be bedlam here in the arena. Oh my God!
Close your eyes. Mothers, send your children to their rooms.
Here we go. Oh my God, look at this. The money clip out of nowhere. Welcome to Midnight Mayhem. Charlie Dreamer, the man coming out from the curtain right now. We saw George South interviewed by myself earlier. There are some dire consequences tonight for both men. If either of these men lose, and one of them will, one of them will not have a career going forward on Midnight Mayhem. You see Brock's kids right there. Charlie Dreamer, the favorite, the fan favorite coming into this matchup. And he's got youthfulness here, but George South, 40 years of experience. Charlie has a tough hill to climb coming up. It looks like George South is gonna talk to us a little bit. Let's see what George South has to say to Charlie Dreamer.
Listen, Charlie Dreamer. You know I'm going to do something I've never did in my whole life. You know how much I love you, Charlie Dreamer, and how much this does not have to happen. So listen, I'm going to ask you something. I know how much these stupid fans mean to you. So I'm going to ask you one thing, Charlie. Either you're going to choose me, and let's end this thing right now, let's walk out of here. Or you're going to choose all these stupid redneck fans. So Charlie, listen. Do not let these stupid people get in your head, buddy, okay? Listen, we go way back and we've been best friends for a long time. So I tell you what, Charlie, let's just end this thing right now. And we'll walk right back out that curtain, and we'll just leave this place right now. We either leave friends, or you leave friends with these people. So Charlie, the decision ain't mine, it's yours. Okay, so listen, Ref, I'm telling you, this decision is his, all right? I'm not getting paid for this. I come here to talk him out of this. And that's a shoot, brother, okay? So listen, Charlie, everybody in this building is looking at you, buddy. Everybody. And this decision is yours. And I'm going to turn my back on you, Charlie, because I'm expecting you to walk right behind me, right out this curtain. Because I'm not going to fight you tonight, Charlie.
best friend.
I hate more than anything to disappoint you, George, but I'm not throwing you out of this ring tonight because for one reason and one reason only. It's something you may have forgot somewhere along the way because you hate everybody. But without these fans here, there ain't no wrestling. So if I have to choose between you and between these fans, it's going to be the same answer, the same reason it's always been for the last 12 years, the fans. There's only one way I know. We never quit, never back down, don't stop till everything's gone. Ring the bell, let's get it started.
Listen, nobody gets the last word, Charlie, on Mr. Number One. So let me get this straight. Let me get this straight. If you lose, you're done. If I lose, I'm finished. Charlie, for the next 30 minutes, I'm putting our friendship up on the shelf, all right? And I'm going to show you 40 years of long trips. I'm going to show you 40 years of why I put my life in this business. I will not lose here tonight, Charlie. I will not lose.
Strong words coming from George South. George South claiming he will not lose, promising the fans of Midnight Mayhem that George South will come out on top with his career still intact. You saw the eyes, you heard what Charlie Dreamer has to say about those great fans. And folks, emotions are running high already, but this, my friend, this is a major deal for Midnight Mayhem. Look at George South. George South, it doesn't seem like his head is in the game, having to wrestle his best friend, Charlie Dreamer. As he said a few seconds ago, having to put their friendship up on that shelf during this matchup. There will be no friendship in this matchup. This matchup is a serious thing. Whoever loses this matchup will not have a career. Whoever loses this matchup will not be wrestling on Midnight Mayhem anymore. Look at George South calling out a family for being a little bit overweight. Now, Charlie Dreamer would never do something like that. George South is a little bit comfortable here. He doesn't seem like his head is in this matchup yet. We saw this a few seconds ago, and this matchup is underway. Charlie Dreamer, George South still dictating the pace of the matchup, not even going for a tie-up. George South is trying to delay the inevitable in this matchup. George South, Charlie Dreamer squaring up right now. George South getting into it with Harold Britt. Of course, Harold Britt's favorite in this matchup would be Charlie Dreamer. Dreamer with the side headlock. George South feeling it right now, trying to fight out of it. Throwing Charlie to the ropes, a big shoulder block by Charlie Dreamer, and Charlie Dreamer building that momentum very early in this matchup. It looks like George South is trying to figure out a way to get past the offense of Charlie Dreamer, the speed and youthfulness of Charlie Dreamer. Now, we do know that Charlie Dreamer was trained by that very man, George South. Now, will George South have all the answers to Charlie's questions? Will George South pull out a few tricks out of his book, his 40 years of experience? Or will Charlie Dreamer go up and over just like that and win this matchup? Folks, we have got this matchup coming up. Welcome back to Midnight Mayhem. Charlie Dreamer still with that side headlock. George South struggling to get out of it. George South trying to get out of it any which way but loose. And Charlie Dreamer cranking it even harder. All that pressure. Look at the knuckle just going into the side of the face of George South. Now that is a good side headlock. That side headlock keeping that pressure on George South. George South throwing Charlie Dreamer off the ropes and grabbing Charlie Dreamer in that sleeper hold. Folks, you're not going to be seeing a lot of flashy moves in this matchup. This is a traditional, old school wrestling match, as you saw that atomic drop right there. And George South right back to the sleeper hold. And look at this, another atomic drop. And George South not going to be able to sit down here at any time in this match. A swinging neck breaker. And Charlie Dreamer back to the neck of George South. I'm telling you, folks, this is a very old school feel in Midnight Mayhem Arena. Something that you don't see every week here on Midnight Mayhem. We have some flashy wrestlers, Xavier Rush even. But then again, we have to bring it back to where wrestling began. And it's just like this, just like a match like this, that you're going to see some of the best professional wrestling in the Mid-Atlantic. Charlie Dreamer still working on the head and neck of George South. George South not really concentrating on the headlock, more concentrating on the fans. Now, George, I'm not going to question your knowledge, but when you're thinking of the Brock's children right there, and you're thinking of the rest of the fans out there in Midnight Mayhem Arena, you need to be focusing on the man who could possibly end your career any second. Big shoulder block. George South off the ropes. George South going under Charlie Dreamer, getting a kick to the gut, and raking the back of Charlie Dreamer. As you can tell, George really did put that friendship up on the shelf, because why would George do something with like a big back body drop right there, or raking the back of his best friend? This is a different side of George South. I know last week we showed an old school match, a Midnight Mayhem flashback, if you will. We saw George and Charlie working together as a unit. George, the father figure to Charlie Dreamer's career. George teaching Charlie everything that he knows. And you see him tonight, it's a markedly different style coming from George South. He's frustrated that Charlie Dreamer picked the fans over him. That's jealousy, and jealousy's not going to get you anywhere, George. Look at George still eyeing the crowd, the people that he is blaming for. If he wins this matchup and has to put Charlie Dreamer's career to bed, George South is blaming the fans. George South still talking to the referee right there, claiming he will not pin Charlie Dreamer. He can't do it. He can't bring himself to end the career of his featured student, Charlie Dreamer. Charlie Dreamer fighting back to his feet, going off the ropes, reversing it, putting George South in the sleeper hold right now. George South struggling. George South getting up. Nice body drop right there on the back of the neck and head of Charlie Dreamer. Both of these men very slow paced in this matchup so far. You know they're building to something in this matchup. And we're building to something on this episode of Midnight Mayhem. Folks, if you want to see Midnight Mayhem at its best, watch us every Saturday night at midnight, but also go on Facebook, Midnight Mayhem CW21. That's where you can find us, facebook.com/Midnight Mayhem CW21. Wallace Rogers, our webmaster, this week did an entire week full of Charlie Dreamer clips and stuff leading up to this matchup. It's a huge deal for us. Would you rather see Charlie Dreamer or George South? Both of these men with many, many years of experience. Now, I don't want to see either of these men have to retire. But that's the stipulation of this matchup. Charlie Dreamer struggling to get back up. George South saying it's over. Your career is over, Charlie. George going back to the nose, the mouth, the eyes, just ripping at that beautiful face of Charlie Dreamer. the thing I find most ironic in this matchup, as George South chokes the life out of Charlie Dreamer. George South has his trunk saying, "I love Jesus." But it looks like instead of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, you're supposed to turn the other cheek, George, but instead you're biting that cheek. Interesting way to interpret the good book, George South. George South telling those fans to come on. He's not concentrating on the threat, the immediate threat in the ring. He's concentrating on the fans who he presumes are the reason he's in this matchup right now. Charlie Dreamer struggling, getting up to his feet. Maybe Charlie Dreamer will come back with some offense right now. Whipping. George South reversed, and it looks like Charlie Dreamer's with the abdominal stretch right now. Now this is a submission maneuver. This is ripping at the abdominal muscles. This is ripping at all of those muscles in your chest, your stomach area, your midsection. This is not a fun move to be put in, and you can see it on the face of George South. George South, big hip toss. George South off the ropes, big shoulder block. George South back. Over Charlie Dreamer. Charlie Dreamer over George South. George South with a kick to the gut, getting those double underhooks right there. And a big suplex coming from George South. George South pulling out all the stops right now, folks. And it's all because of his best friend, Charlie Dreamer. Either one of these men could be gone tonight. We'll be back in a second. You'll find out who. George South still on the offensive. Charlie Dreamer struggling. Big headbutt coming off the big forehead of George South. Charlie Dreamer feeling it right now. Will Charlie Dreamer still be a competitor on Midnight Mayhem after this matchup? Or will George South put to rest a 40-year career? Charlie Dreamer trying to get up. George South concentrating on the fans and not Charlie Dreamer. George South throwing. Charlie Dreamer reversing it. Charlie Dreamer, big back elbow to the face of George South, trying to roll him up right now. 1, 2. George South still in it. Big right hand coming from South. Mr. Number 1 may be Mr. Number 1, 2, 3 by the end of this night. George South claiming it's over, and it's your fault, fans. The reason why Charlie Dreamer will not wrestle again is your fault. But if Charlie Dreamer wins this, folks, George, the reason why you won't be wrestling again is because Charlie Dreamer is the heart and soul of Midnight Mayhem, and those fans fuel the fire that is burning inside Charlie Dreamer. Charlie Dreamer fighting back to his feet. Throwing George. George with a shoulder block. George off the ropes. Charlie Dreamer trying to go for an arm drag or a hip toss. And it looks like he's going for a crucifix pin attempt right now. George South, 1, 2. George out of it. Big right hand to capitalize on that rare weak moment by Charlie Dreamer's defenses right there. Now, this is kind of interesting, folks. George South is not going for these pin attempts. George South does not want to put to bed the career of Charlie Dreamer. George South is fighting with the fans more than Charlie Dreamer. Charlie Dreamer could be taking advantage of all this. Looks like George South has something else to say. We're going to take a listen.
This is the end of Charlie Dreamer. Right here. 1, 2, 3. And then I want to thank all you stupid people for breaking up the greatest friendship that was.
George South once again claiming it is over now. George South with that rear chin lock. Will Charlie Dreamer give up? I have never seen Charlie Dreamer give up on this show, and I don't believe it's starting tonight. Charlie telling George that he is not giving up. He is fighting back for those great Midnight Mayhem fans. George South telling the fans to shut up. Listen to those great fans chanting the name of Charlie Dreamer. Charlie Dreamer fighting back, willing himself up to his feet, and there, fighting back, getting out of that rear chinlock, and George South grabbing the hair of Charlie Dreamer and throwing him down. This match is over, George South says. He's going to end it right now. What is George doing? George, if you want to end the matchup, you got to pin Charlie Dreamer or make him submit. It doesn't look like you're doing this. You're going for a high-risk maneuver that it will not pay off. Look at Charlie Dreamer throwing George South clear across the ring, and a big right hand, a flurry of right hands coming from Charlie Dreamer. Dreamer off the rope, big back elbow by George South. George South going right back, throwing Charlie around. Charlie going down, up, and it looks like it's over for George South. Big super kick by Charlie Dreamer. 1, 2, 3. Folks, we have a winner. But does that mean that George South is going to give up his 40 years of experience? It looks like George South frustrated that the fans were chosen over him. Charlie Dreamer wins this matchup. But what does that mean for the career of George South? Looks like George South not taking that L lightly. Ordering the referee to get out of the ring. George South taking off the tape from his wrist. And it's over. It's over for Charlie Dreamer, perhaps. Perhaps the win was not the only reason for the career versus career. Look at George just choking Charlie with the tape. Charlie Dreamer in a very bad position right now. And I think that might be it for Charlie Dreamer. I believe, even though the George got the pinfall, we might be seeing the end of the person Charlie Dreamer on Midnight Mayhem right now. George South asking for the microphone one more time, pointing at Charlie Dreamer, telling those fans that this is the reason why Charlie Dreamer's laying there like that.
Charlie, you know something? You know, we've been together for a long time. And you know something, Charlie? I never thought the day would come when you would choose these stupid fans over me, okay? So, Charlie, for your kindness to all these people, I'm going to show them exactly what they give you in return, okay? Yeah!
Folks, I hate to say this, but I believe the career of Charlie Dreamer ends with a win, but ends against George South. In the coming weeks, I'm going to try to figure out a way that I can come in contact with Charlie Dreamer. Look at George South with that swinging neckbreaker on the chair. I don't believe Charlie's going to be able to move after this. Folks, I'm going to try to get a word from Charlie Dreamer, maybe from George South. Thank you for watching. I'm sorry, kids.
Listen, Buckwheat. Listen, Adams family. This right here is why I hate every single one of you people. You see, Charlie Dreamer, his career is over. Thanks to all of you stupid people. I am so glad that I'll never see you again.